David,
She's there.
you and I have been doing shows, I don't know, maybe 2 years, something like this. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, and I think we're making history, Jason, and this show is going to be an extraordinary revelation.
I agree. And the reason why I mentioned the time we've been doing shows is because I agree with you, David. I think today's show may make history. For so long, David, we've spoken about Starnet Communications and the goings on there at 425 Carroll Street. For new viewers who are just joining us, before we get into what we're going to be doing today on the sponsor exclusive show that begins at 2 p.m. Eastern on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, we're going to be activating subscribestar.com/reverse CSI storyboards, hopefully in the next few days, help diversify your platform, David. But it's become so important for the viewer sponsors to join us on these sponsor exclusive shows and these alternate platforms, because David, as you and I have discussed ad nauseum on air and basically since we started, social engineers are attacking everything that we do. And the effort is intended to take crowdsource the truth out of circulation, to prevent the information that you've educated me and our viewers about from getting out to the public. And they are effective to a certain degree. They've effectively taken out the 114,000 subscriber strong Jason Goodman YouTube channel. So it's very important that people join us on these alternative platforms. I want to spend our time here on YouTube right now, David, filling people in on exactly what Starnet Communications was, what they did, and why you and I are so interested in them. We can also talk about our visit over there, etc. What would you like to open up with, David?
Well, maybe if you could just pop in the picture that you opened with for the show, because I think it's very
Sure.
revealing. And meanwhile, I will invite people to wish me a happy birthday.
Oh,
right?
Happy birthday. I can't believe I forgot, David. Is it the 7th today?
Yes.
Happy birthday,
I'm not
David.
quite sure how I was born in 43. What does that make me? It makes me very ancient. My fourth quarter of a century, I think, which is really aging. However, and just to set the context, 7th of August, 1998 was a very interesting time, because there was a raid, an attack, bombing attack, on the East African embassies by the organization that I think we'll be discussing today, because we've introduced this term, which I think you and I are very powerful, very attracted to, as the idea of phantom actors, right? Now, phantom actors has a long pedigree, because if you go back to World War II, there was a large number of phantom actors basically positioned behind enemy lines in Germany and places by the BBC and the maker or manufacturer of the world's most powerful transmitters at that time, which was called RCA, which had a wholly owned subsidiary in the United Kingdom called RCA GB 1929. And
Right.
just to set a context, I think, with this term phantom actors, what the BBC and RCA came up with in World War II is the idea, as the Allies or the Brits moved their bombers towards Berlin, the Germans would switch off their radio transmission so the transmitters would not be used as homing beacons for the bombing raids. So what the Brits did, devilish cunning, if you will, together with RCA technology, RCA had two 250 kilowatt transmitters in the States that it couldn't sell for some reasons from the FCC. So the Brits sent an engineer, forget his name, over to the States to buy the two transmitters. They brought them back to the UK, set up a tower, I think it was called the Aspidistra Tower, and brilliantly they upgraded it or rejigged it to 1 megawatts. So at the time, in the Second World War, this was the most powerful transmitter in the world. And then the Brits, what they would do is, as the Germans switched their radios off so they couldn't be used as homing beacons, the Brits would switch on the Aspidistra with perfect speaking Germans, not perfect German speakers, whatever that is, that combination. And as the Germans changed to female newscasters, if you will. The Brits changed to female German-speaking agents, and it was totally discombobulating for the Germans. So,
but David, wait a minute. This is a lot of details about the Aspididra. What does this have to do with Starnet Communications?
Fast forward, because with Starnet Communications, what I think we have is a network of phantom actors that have been built possibly over decades, right, and helped to sell the product from Starnet, which was hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries.
And it's important that we don't bury the lead here, because the thing that we're going to be doing today that is remarkable and unique, and the first time I'm aware of anything like this happening, when we begin the sponsor exclusive segment on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, we're going to be joined by a former executive of Starnet Communications who was present in the building at the time of the raid, and is going to give us remarkable firsthand details about what she witnessed. And this is such sensitive information, particularly given the strike that the Jason Goodman channel has suffered earlier this week. We cannot begin to talk about this on YouTube, not because we're going to be sharing anything illegal or defamatory or whatever, but because YouTube has such draconian and dynamic rules, their terms of service, they can effectively do whatever they want. So this has created a need, David, for you and I to discuss these types of, what will we call it? This is something that's been identified as, what's the phrase from Kinetic North America?
Social engineering protection appliance, which is a patent. Well, this is absolutely fascinating, you see, because the reason I introduced the thing about the Aspidistra is the metaphor is, as you approach target, right, like the Germans being attacked by the Allied bombers, the Germans desperately tried to switch off their transmitters so they wouldn't be used as homing beacons. So what you're facing, I believe, at Crowdsource the Truth by these people is they're switching you off because they see you coming for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're doing everything in their power to try to switch me off, David.
Right, and of course, that's the great compliment, is you get the chaff when you're over target, right? So as we're approaching the target, which is a phantom actor global network, right, that ultimately developed into what is called Phantom Secure, the crime group operating out of Richmond, British Columbia. Remember, that's 20,000 strong, engaged in murder for hire, drug trafficking, prostitution, extortion, and bombing, where it seems that the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, had been infiltrated by a phantom actor by the name of Cameron Ortis. So Cameron Ortis was the head of intelligence for the RCMP, placed there, I believe, by Justin Trudeau and Bob Paulson, the former RCMP commissioner. And Bob Paulson was the officer in charge of the raid on Starnet.
That's very interesting. And I think that we're going to want to share an image of Bob Paulson with our guest, Maria, when she joins us at 2 p.m. Eastern on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Have we heard any additional news about Cameron Ortis, David? It seems like they basically arrested him and now nothing is happening.
Well, I just Googled to see what the latest is, and I'm not quite sure of the date of that, but it turns out that he was in contact with Chinese spies, it would appear,
Ooh.
right? Leaking information on Five Eyes special operations, let's say potentially Five Eyes double-cross operations, to the communist Chinese. And basically, he may be behind a significant number of deaths associated with black operations or double operations inside countries that are targeting the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and America and Canada. So Cameron Ortis is key because I think he would be a classic example of an agent, an actor, right? A phantom actor, because he was at UBC studying for his PhD, and he wrote his PhD thesis, on cyber activity in the Far East. So he traveled in China, right?
Wow.
And he traveled around developing his thesis. So he was the elite advisor to Bob Paulson, right? Who appeared to have got him into a position where he basically exposed the Five Eyes operations to the Communist Chinese. Now,
why do all these guys want to do that, David? Why do they want to sell out their countries to the Chinese, Clinton, and I mean, these are high-level people.
Well, because I think they've walked into these kind of entrapment operations. So what our guest will arrive in the next part of the show will be telling us, I think, is that down in the basement of Starnet, there were studios where they were recording hardcore adult and child pornography, using local folks recruited for that purpose. Now, this is really, really sinister, because what's happened a few blocks away from Starnet on West Georgia Street, there is an office block for Imagist Technologies, right? Now, if you remember, Imagist Technologies was founded by Oliver Buck Revell, who ran onto the tarmac at Heathrow Airport in 1988, right? And took his son, daughter-in-law off the plane before they got onto Panama 103 to blown up. Therefore, I'm making the allegation that Oliver Buck Revell was part of a phantom actor network that had informed him that Panam 103 would be blown up. Now he's operating, at the time of the Starnet raid, a couple of blocks down the road, one more building from a CAI private equity group, and I believe by then he developed a facial recognition service that was following women, for example, through the downtown East Side welfare offices, building a database of women that could be disappeared and not noticed. To be blunt, if you took a white woman from North Vancouver or West Vancouver and she disappeared, all hell would break loose. But
the family would become involved in everything, but now we've got these homeless people who don't have
many of these women and children, let's say they've come in from areas out of Vancouver, they've lost contact with their family or their support groups, they're vulnerable to being preyed upon by the kind of people who go out to the pig farm, to the raves, where these women were quite possibly killed at the pig farm. It's not clear to me where the killing took place, out at the pig farm or at the Burns Road clubhouse. But I do believe it was during the same period women were being tortured in the studios down in the basement of Starnet Communications. And the purpose of that torture, because you asked that question, why are these people betraying their country? Someone might have flown into a luxury hotel in Vancouver, booked a studio down in the basement in Starnet, right? And said, I want, whatever it is they want to turn a movie. And then they're filmed. Remember, you're talking about Hollywood North, right? Doing something to a child, right? That would put them behind bars, and in certain countries, put them on death row, possibly killing the children. So for X years, I believe the Ministry of Children and Families had been subverted or infiltrated by phantom actors who were monitoring and tracking the police, the welfare agents, the tax officials, etc., through Imagist Technologies, and basically then blackmailing them or making sure that they never spoke out about what they had done or what they had seen or what they had witnessed out at the pig farm. And this was an operation that was serving 60 countries. The share value had reached nearly $1 billion. The raid involved, and I think this lady who we will be talking about next part of the show says she thinks there were 150 people in that raid. It was an enormous raid, right?
That is.
Now, the Sex News and Bikers, or Sex Bikers, Sex Bets and Bikers article in Newsweek that talks about that raid is very revealing, because for me, this is what the media wanted us to believe about that raid, right? And they said, for example, that the IRS and the US Customs Service was involved. Our guest in the next part of the show would tell us that
don't
okay,
reveal
sorry,
what she's going to say. We got to let her
okay.
say it. Hang on, David.
Okay,
No, let's just review for everybody what it is that we know. There was this article in Newsweek shortly after the raid. This article comes out October 17th, 1999. When did the raid occur, David? August 20th.
20th of August, 1999.
Right. So this is telling us, let's go over the facts that we know prior to having this opportunity to meet Maria and hear her speak in about 45 minutes when we carry on with the sponsor exclusive segment on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and the sponsor exclusive social media properties for Crowdsource the Truth. You know, David, right now there's an intense amount of activity from social engineers, both on my phone, email, in the comments here. It's not a coincidence. There are people who are maliciously trying to distract my attention and interject here. So let's just review what we know from the reporting, and then when we have a chance to speak to Maria, we can compare what's been published to what she knows.
Yeah, which is the classic way, I believe, of unraveling a phantom actor network or operation. Because the phantom actors are acting, whereas if there was a real raid by these people, there would be something very different and very important at Starnet. That is to say, the evidence would be secured. The chain of custody of the evidence that they took away in this article, right, was not secured. It was broken because we don't know where that evidence went. But that evidence would have recorded, one assumes, a story of hardcore adult and child pornography being generated by this Operation Starnet since 1996 when it was founded. Now, that, of course, would be evidence of a crime all the way up possibly to murder for hire, unbelievable indignities visited on the bodies of the poor victims, etc., and total corruption within the agencies that are responsible for looking after these people. Right? That's what the article is telling us happened. And whenever I see that, and perhaps our listeners will agree, there's something weird about it because the chain of custody was broken. So the people who raided Starnet were actually committing a felony. It's the felony of spoliation, which I believe is punishable by up to 5 years in jail in the States. And if there were people crossing from the border and taking this evidence away, then they are guilty. Whether or not they are treated under Canadian law or American law, I don't care, because what we are entitled to do is make an aggressive inference of guilt. If they've taken evidence away, and let's say it was masterminded by Bob Paulson, the future RCMP commissioner, and they've broken the chain of custody, we are entitled to assume that they are part of the conspiracy to produce and protect hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries online, together with online gaming. And the kind of online gaming that I believe these people were involved in is what's known as Deadpool betting. I can't prove it, right? But Deadpool betting, for those who haven't heard the term before, is where you bet on the time of death, for example, of a high-value target. And if you get within a minute or a second or whatever it is, you scoop the pot. Another form of Deadpool betting is the body count. So if they were taking a bet on the number of firefighters that were killed on 911, then the PRD...
David, I got to stop you because we got to stay focused on Starnet.
Okay,
we get off onto these tangents. We know that the firefighters died on 9/11, but the things I really want to dig into with our guest today, and I'm sorry to interject, David, but I want to keep you very, very focused today because there's a lot of things that this article talks about, and we're going to want to ask Maria very specific questions. So let's go through this. I mean, the thing has told us that basically the police there in Vancouver set this up, they say, by posing as gamblers. So when you say phantom actors, you're not talking necessarily about actors in a play or a movie. You're talking about someone who is engaging in some form of act. So an actor could be a corporation, it could be a person, it could be a social engineer, it could be a lot of different things. But this is talking about the company's websites, Sizzle, Chisel, Red Light. These featured strip shows of all manner and hardcore pornography. The company boasts it had porn customers in more than 60 countries. This executive that we're going to be talking to, she spent some time working there, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so she'll know about all this sort of stuff. Profits soared. Starnet's revenues totaled 9.7 million. Nightline Broadcast said they were a reputable pioneer of internet gambling. So, I mean, a lot of people felt that this was utilizing the new technology. Remember, we got to take ourselves back to 1999. Not everybody had live streaming YouTube channels like we have right now. People did not have Blackberries or iPhones or Android phones. They didn't even exist at this time. So this was a really sophisticated company for the time. You know, what do we know about how the different agencies became involved?
Well, I mean, looking at that article, they're talking about the IRS and customs being, they didn't say in the article that they were part of the raid, but there's another article somewhere else where it is said that they were part of the raid, like there was a SWAT team from the IRS and a SWAT team from the US Customs. Maria will tell us that she disagreed. Well, she doesn't disagree, but she observed different kind of presence at the crime scene that is very indicative. Anyway, the overall gist of that article is, I believe there was a phantom actor network that raided that site and committed the felony of spoliation. Because according to that article, there's no evidence that evidence was protected. Where did it go to? And therefore, what do we infer from the article? We infer from the article that the raid was a phony raid and it was intended to remove the evidence of hardcore adult and child pornography and set the operation up somewhere else. But
that's
it would
our
have to
inference. Yes.
Yes, it's an inference. Well, if the evidence disappears, it's got to go somewhere. But it never appeared in court. None of the directors, as far as I can see, of Starnet were ever prosecuted.
Well, they even said in this CBC article that was updated November 10th, 2000, Vancouver-based internet company Starnet Communications says it faces no criminal charges and is cooperating with authorities after a police raid.
And which authorities were they cooperating with, right?
We don't know.
Remember, you've got Cameron Ortis, right, who moves away, and then you've got Bob Paulson, who becomes the RCMP commissioner. So it looks like this was a preemptive raid, and I'm suggesting that we can discuss it with Maria in the next part of the show. I think this was a preemptive raid of people pretending to be gamblers, pretending to be CIA, pretending to be this, pretending to be that. But the key thing is they've taken all the evidence of a criminal network, a global criminal network. Remember, 60 countries, right? That is actually downloading this stuff, right? Probably using facial recognition, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe there's 20,000 people who have been compromised by the raid, and someone now has that evidence to hand, and they can extort them and blackmail them because they have evidence of these people participating out at the pig farm or down in the studios. So when people, you asked earlier, why do people do this? Well, there's a variety of reasons. One of them may be that they've been entrapped in an encounter with an underage person, all right, and they're being blackmailed. And then you are owned for the rest of your life.
Right, some form of blackmail seems likely, of course. Now, David, there's another component to this that I know you're very interested in, the revelations of Mossack Fonseca, the Panama Papers, as it's known. What can we say about that?
Right. Now, the Panama Papers, when they were released, showed links to high-level people in the Chinese government, to Bill Clinton and his friends, Putin, and so on. And basically, it would appear that Panama was being used as a tax haven by law firms acting for clients. And I think you and I discussed the other day how easy it would be for a law firm to entrap a client by giving them advice where they put their assets in an abusive tax shelter and then threatening to reveal them to the IRS. And if you can infiltrate your people who have been compromised by maybe showing up at the studios at Starnet and get them inside the IRS or the Canada Revenue Agency, you can monitor these people and basically threaten them. All right, we'll have an IRS raid on you. We'll take all your money. You'll pay triple damages and you'll go to jail. All right. So just for example, in the Panama Papers, now whether that was an intentional leak to frighten the people who were taking out the advice for the tax havens, I don't know. but it would be very relevant to gather evidence at Starnet that could ultimately be used to extort the lawyers acting for clients in the Panama.
Well, but the interesting thing, David, is that, you know, those Panama Papers, it was originally released by this international consortium of investigative journalists. And one of the people named in it is Mark Dolan, who was the CEO of Starnet Communications, now resides in Brazil. And we'll dig into some of this in Open Corporates. I'm definitely going to want to ask Maria what, if anything, she knows about this. But look at all these companies this guy is involved in here. Exotic soap, coffee, online lighting, electronic commerce, Starnet USA Inc. That's interesting, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm seeing that for the first time. But you see, and I like your point, because you talked about that yesterday, that we'd often historically talked about crisis actors. But the advantage of calling it a phantom actor is, as you point out, it could be a corporation.
Correct.
And then, of course, we're in the federal bridge, because basically a corporation like Boeing or whatever, or Entrust, could be brought into one of these crime scenes, if you will, using phantom actors and set up and subsequently blackmailed because they've been compromised. So the raid on Starnet, I think, it's a pivotal event. 20th of August of 1999, it took them 3 days. In that article that you talked about, they carried cartloads of documentation, computers and servers away, and that evidence has disappeared. I'm sure it's still there, and I'm sure the content, that hardcore adult and childcore content, is now migrated to the cloud, right? So that you can download, you can do a search under a name, Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton, and have her tracked through facial recognition through all her activities around the world, or Bill Clinton's activities, including going out to the island with Ghislaine Maxwell. All right, and the criminal insurgency, as I call it, will have a complete breakdown of the sexual habits of people like Bill and Hillary Clinton, right? And compromising enough so that those two are controlled agents. They have to be, right? So Bill and Hillary Clinton will be terrified of this material coming out, which is sufficient reason to put a raid together and get hold of the evidence before the legitimate police do. So I don't think that a legitimate cop inside that raid would have allowed the evidence to be removed from that site without just normal standard crime scene investigations precautions. And it's the same as happened at the pig farm. All of the evidence of the pig farm, where's it gone? Right? This is associated with the worst case of serial killing perhaps in North American history. I have some First Nations friends who believe there may have been 100 women and children killed out at that pig farm. Over to you.
That is shocking. Well, David, so sort of the three main articles that we've historically referred to on this topic have been this one from Wired Magazine. This is from August 20th, 1999, saying porn shop raided by Mounties. But the strange contradictory thing here is that it's talking about, okay, so it's a joint force of Vancouver police and Canadian Mounties. And they entered the Starnet office and they kicked out the employees and began searching through all of their paper and electronic records. The officers will be in there all weekend, said Anne Drennan, spokesperson for the Vancouver police. And there was an 18-month sting operation into illegal smut peddling. And so this is where they posed as gamblers and opened accounts, I guess, on these things. We've got, the company runs both porn sites and casinos, and missteps in either business could easily have landed it in hot water with the Canadian cops. President of Electronic Frontier Canada said. He's just an independent, internet guru who is consulting on that. So I think we're going to bring a lot of clarity to this today, David, because it's really unbelievable that we have this opportunity. And this is somebody that contacted you, has been watching the show for a while. She was an executive at Starnet Communications and was present on the day of the raid. We're going to have this amazing opportunity to speak to her in just about 30 minutes when we proceed with the sponsor exclusive segment that people can watch by joining us on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. It's more important now than ever, David, that people sponsor you and me and join us on these alternative platforms, because they're just trying to destroy Crowdsource the Truth. The emails are coming, the chats from social engineers are trying to distract us. They don't want people to hear this information. YouTube is trying to take out the channel. What else do you think we should ask Maria when she joins us?
Well, there's another article, and in the title line it says the crime of the future. So if you Google Starnet crime of the future, it talks about, I think, the Hells Angels and how different this particular crime associated with Starnet was, maybe to historic, because they were laying down a pattern. Yeah, I think this is very interesting. So what they seem to be saying in this article today is, then
September 11th, 2000, David.
You've got it. There are no coincidences. You see, I think these are messages to people, right? That they were planning September the 11th way before, obviously, it occurred.
Wow.
But just look. So the Angels, which historically has been associated with hogs, right? I believe they've always been and will always be a franchise operation controlled by much more powerful organizations that control their communications networks. If Canada decided, or the United States decided, to shut down the Hells Angels, they're gone, right? Confiscate the hogs, basically confiscate or destroy their clubhouses, make it illegal to wear their patches, etc., etc. But they're tolerated, and they're given what I think in British crime they call the turf. There's a certain turf, like the Vancouver ports, that's been given to the Hells Angels.
Wow.
But they're not allowed to stray from their territory. If, however, they do stray, then another crime group is told, you got to take these guys out. So they basically use the different crime groups to kill each other when necessary. As a means of control. But further up the ladder, of course, is the crime of the future is associated with, I believe, the use of public key infrastructure and virtual private networks, where basically you can plug into the internet, you can pull out those particular elements that you need to send into the crime scene and destroy evidence at the crime scene. And at the end of it, essentially, it's a white-collar digital crime with no paper trail. So it's much more difficult for the police to get inside it, right?
You know, David, something is occurring to me as I read this article. This is fascinating, and this is why I love it when you and I start talking about these things and exploring them in real time. You were talking about how somebody like Bob Paulson, you know, we look at these articles, he appears to be involved in this raid, he appears to be getting this guy Cameron Ortis into the position that he needs to be in the RCMP in order to be able to spy for China. And I think, myself at least, most people may immediately presume, well, this is a bad guy with sinister intent. He's plotting all this criminal stuff. But as you've just pointed out, perhaps he's being influenced. Perhaps he's an honest officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and he's somehow been entrapped, coerced, otherwise forced to engage in these horrible criminal acts, and maybe he has no choice. I'm looking at this segment in the article that you've just brought to my attention about a CIA report. Now again, I don't know if we can trust the CIA, but according to this report, American girls were being smuggled from the United States to Canada specifically for sexual exploitation. Now it refers to them as women, so it's unclear if we're talking about adult women or underage girls, but many of the women, according to this report, are recruited to Vancouver with false promises of jobs as exotic models and exotic dancers. Now, exotic model, exotic dancer, that reeks of code word for being a stripper. But, you know, there are stories of model agents stopping beautiful young women on the street and saying, you've got the look, here's my business card, I'm a model recruiting agent. I've had friends who this has happened to, and they start modeling careers. It happens. Young women who perhaps are very, you know, fashion conscious or vain or think they're beautiful and want that kind of reassurance from someone could be lured to a job as a model in Canada, and perhaps once they get there, they're housed. I've known people who have worked as models, they sometimes get put in hotels, they're grouped with other models, they're booked on flights to events, to things where maybe they're not perhaps 100% in control. Perhaps these women are coerced. Perhaps Bob Paulson was coerced.
Well, and isn't that the model, the business model of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, right?
Exactly.
Which means that this business model, I think they pioneered it in Vancouver because it was out of the reach of the RICO legislation, alleged in the FBI. Vancouver became known as Hollywood North, where you know more about the transfer of business from Hollywood up here because it's a lower cost regime to make a movie. Then you have people
NAFTA,
involved.
by the way,
Yeah.
sorry, David, NAFTA caused that. So now we're getting into Bill Clinton. Perhaps there was a bigger, I know about this because it affected my industry. Visual effects basically collapsed in Los Angeles and moved to Canada because they could get 40% off tax revenue, or tax credit or whatever, and it was English-speaking artists in a sophisticated country.
Well, so that comes back to my that sort of acronym I have of BIDMAP. You create a network of phantom actors globally in 60 countries, now perhaps 100, so you've got them everywhere. They're people who have various skill sets. They're recruited, they're cast to play a role. That technique goes back to World War II. Right? So the historical continuity of this, for me, is just totally fascinating. Sex as a means of entrapping agents, where it goes back probably forever, but one Victor Rothschild, who oversaw the transition from the OSS to the CIA at the end of the Second World War in Paris, he allowed his apartment in London to be used by Guy Burgess and Anthony Blunt for homosexual pedophile orgies, right? Well, what do you get out of that? You get the film. You get the film that ultimately extorts these people. Now, they may be condemned at one level, but I think it's so vitally important not to focus on the blackmail victim, but to focus on the organization put together by the blackmailer.
Right.
And now we're talking about an international signals intelligence network that is run by what I call a criminal insurgency to identify those individuals in target countries. The explosion in Beirut is a classic example. Again, I want to stay with the topic, but I think it's vitally important to understand the business model that was pioneered at Starnet has now been exported around the world by the people who took the networking, the hardware, the servers, and the software away with them, but did not use it to bring a prosecution in court.
Now, let me present you with something that I am hopeful will blow your mind, David, because I've been speaking about this for a while, and this is an example of how, you and I, certainly on David Hawkins' Discovery CSI, we're not so focused on breaking news. You and I aren't taking trips to Beirut the minute we hear there's an explosion to investigate that. You and I look at evidence, we put together puzzle pieces that sometimes span decades. I want to talk to you about Canadian fashion mogul Peter Nygard. Now, just a few weeks ago, he's asked the court to dismiss a class action lawsuit against him. This is alleging that he sexually assaulted dozens of women. Now, this is the Vancouver Courier. Peter Nygard is described as a Canadian fashion mogul. We've spoken quite a bit, David, about the use of these 727 jets. It's very curious to me that multi-millionaire moguls would be interested in a 50-year-old aircraft. It just doesn't seem like the type of thing that would be done. These aircraft are not operated for that kind of time frame unless there's a very specific need. And David, inside Peter Nygard's aircraft, we've identified this stripper pole with the very conspicuous compass rose that is the logo of the CIA. Now, we've heard just from that report about the Starnet raid that the CIA seems to think that women are being lured to Canada with the promise of being models or dancers. Peter Nygard offered a lot of people modeling jobs to model his fashion wear, and he certainly would, it would be suggested by the presence of this pole. This is a stripper pole and has been described as a stripper pole, but this is where exotic dancers would do their dancing, and it would be very convenient to photograph, video record, murder, throw out the back, do a lot of things on this 727. What do you think about this, David?
Well, I think that comes back to that extraordinary term, crime of the future. Back in 1999, when this raid, as you point out, there were emerging technologies, particularly the internet. I don't know about the cloud. I seem to find that the BlackBerry came out with a smartphone around that time. So there were technologies around, and people looking forward, and criminal organizations are very quick to jump on, embrace, adopt, and try and monopolize new technologies that allow them to pursue their crimes of the future, if you will, and not face interception or justice through the people who are basically left in the wake. But if you remove all the evidence from a crime. So I think what we've got here, we can treat the Starnet raid as a pivot point into the crime of the future for me, because to put together a raid with 100 to 150 people, depending on your point of view, of people who picked up all of this evidence. It was 3 floors. The arresting or the senior officer at the site, I think he's Corporal Headley, he said it was like Star Wars in there, right?
Very sophisticated technology.
Yeah, so therefore someone, possibly McDonald Detweiler out at Richmond, British Columbia, needed to integrate, and systems integration is very different from systems development. It's like clipping together different elements of packages that would have been available in that building, where if you recollect above Starnet, there was an outfit called AMIC, which had the contracts for the upgrade of Wedge 1 of the Pentagon and
Right.
the diesel systems in the building number 7, and the contract to remove evidence. Well, does that ring a bell? Why would you give the company, AMIC, the job of upgrading communication systems within a target building that got taken out on 9/11, and give that same company the responsibility for removing evidence? Isn't that exactly what happened at Starnet? You've got a building
exactly
where
right,
the first
David.
3 floors, you've got Starnet. The floors above, you've got AMIC or H.A. Simons or whatever it is. And that building is then raided, and all of the evidence that would indicate the crime of the future, right, that paved, I believe, for the transition from Starnet into 60 countries, into Phantom Secure, based out of Richmond, British Columbia, with 20,000 criminals using modified BlackBerries linked to the head of intelligence for the RCMP, Cameron Ortis, who was put in that position, I believe, in a conspiracy, or maybe through blackmail or extortion, by Justin Trudeau and Bob Paulson. And remember, just before, because we're getting near the end, Justin Trudeau at UBC, his roommate at, I think, Douglas House, was a guy called Christopher Charles Ingvaldson, who was charged, arrested, and convicted and jailed as a director of an international porn ring. Pedophile
Coincidence.
Porn.
Yeah.
Well, there are no coincidences. So
Right.
what did Justin Trudeau know, and when did he know it? And is he not sheltering the crime of the future? Whether it's through blackmail, extortion, or whatever, you've actually got an extraordinary situation where the crime of the future was the crucible, or the basically proof of concept, I believe, was developed at the Starnet building. The raid took all of the important networking and software away, and they set up, perhaps either in Antigua or Panama or Hong Kong or whatever.
I'm convinced it's on those jets, David, because remember, James Patterson's book, Filthy Rich, tells us that Epstein had a trading floor on his jet. And Charles Ortel has told us separately that there is no record of Jeffrey Epstein ever conducting any trade at all. So therefore, we must presume that when author James Patterson sees a bunch of computers on the jet and it's explained to him as being a trading floor, perhaps those computers are doing something else. Perhaps This is a recreation or a relocation of the gear from Starnet communications on board a jet, where it can move around. It can do things outside of the jurisdictions of any particular law enforcement agency. It can throw the evidence of whatever it's done out the back of the jet, of the 727. And it would also explain that if you had all this complicated computer equipment that you integrated into a jet, why you might choose to continue using that jet even if it was beyond the reasonable lifespan of a jet like it.
And maybe you can engage in Deadpool betting. Remember, just to remind people, Deadpool betting is where you place bets on the time of death of a high-value target. Well, the people who were killed above the point of impact on the North Tower, you could say that many of them died at 8:46:46, right? And of course, when both towers were brought down, probably through a hack of the Motorola radio systems, where the technology was bought from McDonnell Detweiler, you can basically bet on the body counts of the firefighters. So if you get 343, you scoop the pot. So that I like the idea that the pivot point in the crime of the future was at Starnet on the 20th of August, 1999, that the people who raided it were wearing, in some cases, uniforms. I think you call those slicker coats or whatever it is. And basically the objective of the raid was not to shut down Starnet, but to take preemptively pick up all of the evidence and take that kid away, install it somewhere else, and expand it ultimately into the crime of the future, where these kind of crimes are basically executed over the cloud or the Federal Bridge Certification Authority. Over to you.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think everything that you're saying is consistent with transferring the technology that was at Starnet to a mobile platform and getting it out of there. And it's interesting to note that none of the people who have been, nobody's been charged with any crimes. So why? I mean, they had this big bust. They were up to pretty treacherous stuff, gambling and porn and potentially snuff films. David, we're just about at the end here of our lead-in to what is sure to be an incredible interview with our guest, Maria, who is a former executive of Starnet Communications. She's going to be sharing with us her firsthand recollections of exactly what occurred on that day in 1999, where she was present during this raid. People are going to be able to watch that interview on patreon.com/reverse-CSI-storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to remind people, David, that it's very important that they sponsor the co-hosts on Crowdsource the Truth and that they join us on these platforms that are not YouTube, that are more difficult for social engineers to target and eliminate. I realize it represents a paid subscription from our viewers, but it's very important that we keep these lines of information open and that people can continue to hear this sort of stuff. So for really a reasonable monthly fee, people can join us, maintain access to the information, and David, frankly, keep you and I going. People who are just hearing about this stuff for the first time can learn more about David and his research by going to reversecciscripts.com. You can download his vectorized templates that allow you to view. This is licensed vector analysis. You're going to have several patents in there that David has explained to us that are critical to this operation. You can also follow David on Twitter at CSI Hawkins. Please join David there, and please join us for the sponsor exclusive segment that's about to begin. David, real quickly, any final words before we transition over and speak to Maria?
Yeah, the raid on Starnet basically ushered in the crime of the future that is now sitting, I believe, in the cloud and on the Federal Bridge, where there is an organization, a criminal insurgency, engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography and Deadpool betting. Over to you.
Yeah, and I mean that real-time betting on event count outcomes, that ties into Howard Lutnick, who lived right near Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, all of this could be, all of this could be coincidental, David, but boy, it's a remarkable string of coincidences if I've ever seen one.
Right. It's the crime of the future.
All right, we'll be back in just about 10 minutes. We're going to get Maria on the line, and we'll see everybody on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you so much to the generous sponsors that make this and every other show on Crowdsource the Truth possible. Couldn't do this work without you, and please remember it's very important to support the co-hosts. David, I'll see you on Patreon and Subscribestar in just 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jason. Bye now.
Thank you.